Well, thanks for inviting me to come to this campus. Actually, Moss and I used to come here quite often and give seminars, but we haven't been back here for a while, so good to see some of you, and there's a bunch of new faces, and glad to see you. If I remember, I think they had the American Ag Econ meetings here in 1988. I think that you hosted, and somebody told me that I was supposed to give the Fellows Address in that year in 1988. But I never did give the Fellows Address because I got the dates mixed up and the times were mixed up, so I never did give the address. But I don't think it was that meeting. I think it was a meeting in Chicago when this all happened. But the profession got this straightened out when they gave I gave the Wall lecture a few years later. And now I see they canceled the Wall lecture for a different reason, so that's no longer in the books. So, but I'm glad to be here. And I know some of you from the past, and our gentleman here, glad you're joining us in the multi-state project. And Karen is actually a student of our son Troy, and part of this work is as the stuff we're doing as a joint project, the three of us, on this topic. So some of you know that my area of expertise is mostly in welfare economics, cost-benefit analysis. Although my background's really in trade, but I also try to deal with economics, international trade economics from a perspective of the notion of welfare economics and cost-benefit analysis. And as you know, that this is a very difficult subject because it implies a lot of value judgments and politics and the whole area of doing benefit cost analysis. And especially when in the area of tobacco, and some of you people have worked in tobacco, and I've worked with some people in your department on tobacco, especially in the 2004 buyout, the tobacco program. So this topic was dear to my heart when I wrote the mechanical tomato harvester paper, and that was in 1971. With Dave Seckler on the whole impact of mechanization, as an example. And by the way, for those of you that are interested, we have a volume coming out on mechanization, where I make the argument that lots of times when we do work on estimating the rates of return to agricultural research, that we ignore the big part of that may well be the ag mechanization part. So in other words, if you look at the sugar business at the moment, you talk about increase in sugar yields. You can't get an increase in yields without also developing a different harvester to combine these yields and combine these sugar fields, right? So there's this whole jointness between mechanization and plant breeding, etc. I think we miss that jointness, so I think we're way underestimated, in my opinion, on some of this rates of return to research. But why don't we do more work? It's because you can't get money, you can't get data from John Deere tractor and all the things that everybody privately develops, these mechanical harvesters and these air drills we use, etc. That's part of the reason. So we still focus on rates return to research in terms of plant breeding. But I think if you looked at also the jointness with that and agricultural mechanization, you get a whole different field of this whole thing. But anyway, so back to this topic about producer compensation. So some of you people are right-wing, I'm sure, and some people are left-wing, and we get into this debate in terms of what happens and why should the government be involved in a lot of this business as we do in agriculture. So this is this topic to talk about. So I want to first of all talk about the case in Ontario, Canada. In 2009, they eliminated the tobacco program in 2009 in Canada. And some people here would wonder, like they didn't even think they grow tobacco in Canada. But they do actually in the province of Ontario. So they asked us to take a look at this topic about this tobacco buyout. So the bottom line of this is the government, in my opinion, didn't have any idea what they're going to do with this tobacco program. It had never thought through what does it mean to terminate the tobacco program. Sounded like a good idea. The health advocates, they thought it was a great idea because they thought they're going to quit producing tobacco. Right? So they're all, the doctors and all these community people were behind this buyout and said, it's time to get rid of tobacco, so let's go ahead and terminate this program. The only thing as we found out is you'd already expect tobacco production didn't go down, it went up actually as a result of the buyout. But you see, my point is in economics that when you do this benefit cost analysis, if you don't get the theory right, you might as well not even do the analysis. Because if you did the theory right, as I want to show you, I'm not bragging here, but if you do the theory right, you're going to predict the results actually what did happen. So you had this increase in production, etc. And it turns out there's huge welfare gains by getting rid of the tobacco program. But only because it wasn't the program that they designed to put in place. It was by fluke that it ended up to be a good program at the end, but it wasn't that program as the end result. It was based on a totally different program than the one they thought they implemented at the time they got rid of the tobacco buyout. So it's kind of an ex-ante, ex-post type of analysis we have. And this is just some indication of the Ontario production and prices and of tobacco, and the production was kind of stable or increasing and prices fluctuated. But the big, are you ready? Yeah, just keep going, whatever the cigarette sales. I want to get back to a simple model I'm going to show this. Go ahead. So if you can read this, so we did this work, and we can send you a copy. This is coming out in one of the journals, this paper. I don't know, you can look at this work. So here you had a government program that was being terminated, and actually in this particular case it was terminated with federal money, right? Money from the feds. So when they terminated this program, the farmers got this check from the government. It wasn't like the U.S. tobacco buyout I want to talk about. That was a consumer tax or processor tax. This is a buyout from the government for the Treasury's money, paying this money. So then when you take a look at this issue about the impacts of the buyout, we got this little chart to show a whole different array of what would happen under different models of this buyout. So you remember, in this particular case, if you're a consultant, say for the Ontario tobacco industry, you're obviously going to try to get the maximum amount of money for producers in the compensation, right? Now, if you're working for the health advocates, you may get something totally different. But you can all different arrays of outcomes depending on how you handle it. And of course, one case is that you'd have zero production models. And that's the one that they thought they had designed. They thought they were going to actually end up with zero production and not this increase of production that actually happened. So we go through this literature to show about different ways you could have compensated these producers based on some theoretical models. Right? And what you're going to find out, the sums of money vary greatly depending on what approach you want to take to compensation. So with the producers, fortunately for them, they actually picked the method of compensation, in our opinion, that generated obviously the highest returns. Yeah, that's $300 and some billion. So go ahead. So just quickly, I want to go through this. So those of you that are in this business know this stuff. So one of the most misunderstood issues in economics, in my effect, is a simple notion of a theory of a quota, right? So when you put on a quota, right, you're moving from a theory from competitive equilibrium Q0 to Q1. And you see what's interesting and important about that model is that you end up with a quota rent. And this is where the debate actually starts. The quota rent of P1, P2, CA is what the true value of the quota looks like. Now, the producers never gained that whole value of the quota, right? Because the producer's gain is P1, P0, DA minus DCB. And that's where we always get mixed up in the literature and what we discuss about what the producer gain, net gain was versus what the quota value is. So they're different, right? So by the way, to make it even more interesting at the present time in this topic, at least in the Canadian perspective, Canada is heavily dominated with supply management industries, right, and agriculture. So you got the chickens are all governed by supply management. The eggs industry is all governed by supply management. The dairy industry is governed by supply management. Turkey's under supply management. Simple model of this nature, right? Supply management is essentially, in simple terms, is this model here. So right. So now at the present time, if you're a dairy farmer in Alberta, Canada, or Quebec, Ontario, or farmers in Quebec, actually the value of a quota now for a milk cow is $30,000. $30,000. If you've got to buy 200 cows in the dairy business, you got to buy a quota attached to each cow for about $30,000, about these quota rents. So now the government, of course, has gotten curious, so they're doing these big investigations into this whole supply management business. And Rick Baricello is a colleague of mine at the University of British Columbia, and he works with the conference board and some of LaRue from University of Laval. They've gotten into these numbers, and they make the argument that if you're going to terminate the dairy industry in Canada in terms of getting rid of supply management, they're going to buy out these quotas. Again, depending on the method of compensation they want to use, which is part of our paper here, it could come up to $40 billion to get rid of the dairy industry in Canada. These quota rents have gotten so big that, I mean, it just shows you how the magnitude when it comes to the buyout. If you're going to buy out the industry using, quotes, this value of the quota, which is usually a common discussion, is to pay it according to the value of that quota that's involved from the marketplace, right? So now, but when we never written it, go ahead, Karen, what we never written much about is what happens when you remove these quotas? So it's one thing to talk about the theory of putting quotas in place, but what about the theory about what happens when you get rid of these quotas in the press time? So if you take a look at this simple model, and this is, Karen, where trade comes in, you can't do these models without trade in here. Because like a case in Canada, Canada's a large cigarette exporter to China, for example. And then the US for a long time was a huge tobacco exporter, not just domestic consumer. So these simple models, what I try to do are not simple, but we separate this domestic demand from the total demand curve, right? And then we have some notion of a supply curve. So now when you get this quota put in place, what you're essentially doing is you're taking a quota moving from Q0, and then you're moving it to Q1, and then you can work out the distribution among domestic in the industry and the foreign industry in those models, right? But the value of the quota still appears there, because now in this particular case with this this quota in place here, you have the value of the quota P2CA P1, right? For that model in terms of that quota that arrived. So now when you look at that graph, you think this is pretty interesting. So what happens now but I can show you 4 different approaches to compensation there. So I'm just talking about the value of the quota approach, right? So I can also say what happens with zero production? What happens if they really would have listened to the mandate and enforced zero production of cigarettes, where you couldn't, or tobacco, you couldn't produce any more tobacco? So of course in that particular case you got to go back to the origin when all this stuff disappears, right? So you have to work out the welfare economics effects of zero production and then these other means of compensating. So before I switch to the American one, so what happens is, this is, and I have no, I'm a producer myself, right, in Saskatchewan. We're large farmers, and then the grain business, and we're not in supply management, you can tell that. But anyway, so I give producers all the credit in the world. I mean, and it comes down to this notion of rent-seeking behavior when producer groups lobby governments for whatever they get out of these packages, whatever they're going to do. And powerful lobbyists know how to lobby, and powerful producer groups know how to lobby in terms of their associations and how they lobby. So even do all the economics in the world you want, doesn't mean they're going to listen to your analysis at all, actually, because it all comes back to the political process at the end when they make these decisions. So what's amazing here is when you look at the politics of this whole thing, there is also in the books in Ontario was what they call the basic production quota. And the basic production quota was in the books of what the quota was in 1953. So that amount. So they took the quota that existed, the production in 1953. And guess what? That's a box we can't even show on this diagram, but that's a box that looks like something like P2WN P3. Right? It was some quota value that had nothing to do with the actual quota production of Q1. In fact, it was likely 3 times larger than that actual production in place when it had to buy it. So they based the numbers on that argument, and they says we should have, because legally the farmers were entitled to be paid on that basis. I've talked to a lot of lawyers, and there's no legal basis of any of this, actually, by the way. There's no legal basis that farmers should have gotten compensated even at zero amounts, right? And that's a big debate. You know, you get into North Carolina, you know some of the professors there that argue that farmers shouldn't get compensated zero for these buyouts when it happens. We get that whole rate. But it's pretty interesting. The compensation actually ended up to be based on this quota over here, which, as you can see, is way larger than the value of the quota on the basis of what actually was being produced. Right? And they got this $300 and some million. It was almost pure profit in terms of the buyout. Yeah. So what happens though when you do the analysis and you look at the buyouts, it's a success, because what happens is the gainers gain more than what the losers lost. So as a result, the program was a big failure. It wasn't a failure, it was a huge success. Right? But it isn't the program they set up with. It didn't go to zero production, right? So what happened is, as this model will tell you, when you get rid of this quota, you're going to go to some other equilibrium output and prices which are way higher than what you started up with. Right? That's what that model will tell you. Now this, when I shift to the U.S. tobacco buyout, that is not the case at all. That's a totally different model than this one. This is a payout from the government to end this tobacco program. And our paper shows theoretically the different approaches to compensation the government could have used, and the government picked the one that generated the maximum return ever possible for farmers. Now the one thing I'm going to talk and conclude my talk about a controversy we're having with some MIT economists and the Food and Drug Administration on tobacco. And it comes down to simply this debate when you're thinking about it. So you people that study welfare economics, what does the area under a demand curve mean for tobacco smoking? See, this stuff is all predicated on our work and concept of economic surplus, right, stuff. So in other words, we attach welfare meetings to areas under demand curves, the notion of consumer surplus, just like we do economic rent to the farmers above the supply curve. So I'm going to conclude with a comment about what does this surplus really mean on the demand for cigarettes when you put it into the cigarette market space, about this debate we're having about the Food and Drug Administration, about the goodness and badness of smoking. Okay? So now on the US, so this is, if you want this paper, this is a paper we have coming up. So anyway, we'll switch to a moment to the US case. You can ask questions after that, okay? You want to switch to the US? Yeah, truly. So yeah, you can go right over to the there we are, we can use that one. So in the U.S. buyout in 2004, as you people already know, farmers were compensated a little over $9 billion to be paid in equal installments over a 10-year period for the buyout. And interestingly, in this particular case, this money did not come from the taxpayers. Unlike the Ontario case, this money came from a tax. And it's called a consumer tax, but what it really was a tax on tobacco companies, etc., which obviously also got shifted to the consumer of tobacco, of cigarettes. So we can debate what percentage did or what didn't. So you could say only 50% of the pass-through went through to consumers, smokers. Some of it didn't, some of it did. But it was a consumer tax idea. Right? And if those of you who are interested, we have a couple papers published in the theoretical journals on theoretical taxes that we use. But this is kind of a simple model when you think about it. So if I'm in the simplest case, I just draw a demand curve and a total demand curve. It's the same like before, and I get my trade arguments over here. So this is my competitive equilibrium. And by the way, this isn't a competitive equilibrium. This is an equilibrium with all tobacco taxes in place. I mean, you study tobacco, you got huge taxes from the government already and all this stuff. So this isn't a free market competitive equilibrium. It's an equilibrium net of taxes, whatever you got in here, this equilibrium here. So anyway, we go ahead and we put on this quota. We got this quota Q1, and the same argument before. So we end up with a quota rent of P2 C A B P1. And you see what's interesting about that model is now this payment to these farmers, etc., this amount that was paid to say the value of this quota, this $9 billion. Doesn't come from the government, it comes from this treasury tax. So there's no this tax on tobacco. So when you think about it, if these producers were earning this quota, say take P1, P2, C8 from the tobacco program, if that's all you were compensated, the producers wouldn't gain a nickel, right? So those rents were already in place. So those producers would have to get compensated more than that quota value for them to be a net gain to producers, right? Because they were already earning this from the marketplace. These quota rents are in those marketplaces in terms of the rents, rental rates from tobacco, and you got literature web data on the rental rates and also the land value. So therefore, there must be something more to this model than just paying the value of the quota. The $9 billion, what did it represent? Well, it works out that even under reasonable elasticities, these producers were paid a way more than the value of the quota, far exceeded. So in other words, over the 10-year buyout period, these producers got a quota value, given their elasticities, much greater than the quota value of P2CA. Right? What they were paid was a quota value of like roughly MNOL, right? Which gave you an equilibrium to the left of the quota equilibrium. Right. So I can measure the overcompensation of this quota by the distance between this Q1 and this Q2 working us all out in this model. Right? So therefore, we have this paper coming out that shows the amount of overcompensation that was paid in the tobacco buyout. Now, over what I mean, they should have been paid maybe more. I'm not making a value judgment whether they should or shouldn't have. I'm just saying they actually got paid in the sense they got more than the quota value was, or else they wouldn't have even supported the buyout. Right. So they had to have some net gain in it, or they wouldn't do it. So therefore, we argue that there's a quota value in there that's Q to the left of this quota that was in place. Now, some of these eminent economists that supposedly I know in that profession, they've worked in tobacco a long time, but and I like all of them, but this is a case where the names I won't mention, they're all wrong on this topic. Totally wrong. And the reason they're wrong is because they don't use the right model. They're still using our tobacco model for Canada to argue this case, but you can't do it. Because you see what this model is telling you? Exactly what happened in reality. See, these guys were arguing, once you got rid of the tobacco program in the US, production was going to skyrocket, right, which never happened. See? Production dropped drastically after the US buyout. It's come back a little bit, but in terms of this new stuff we do in production functions, but nothing compared to what it was. And you see, that's what you'd expect. Because you see, in this particular model with a 10-year buyout, and if you're going from here to here, production should go down, which it did. See, that's what a consumer tax model is so different than a buyout from the government, right? So one of these tax models is going to give you the right result of what happened in U.S. tobacco case, just the opposite to Canada, because of this whole tax issue here. And I know there's some literature written on this, and they argue, well, the models are too complicated and we can't figure out what happened, but sure you can figure out what happened, because there's a clear reason with that model that production of tobacco actually didn't go up, it actually went down. So now, this debate with these MIT scholars, etc., this tobacco, and with the Food and Drug Administration. And maybe you follow this debate in the New York Times recently again. This whole business about regulating tobacco and marijuana, and the whole debate we're in it all the time, addiction and addictive goods. So they argue that the Food and Drug Administration was totally wrong and they're much too lenient on granting licenses for these new tobacco products, etc., and that they actually take the approach that we should almost terminate the smoking of cigarettes. It's like the approach taken by Bloomberg, for example, Bloomberg television guy, when they make these statements, you should terminate smoking totally. Well, and also there's some literature on addiction there, and they go to the health economics literature, and they make the argument, does any of this stuff make sense when you have the people who are addicted to smoking and those who aren't, but you have the same aggregate demand curve? So your demand curve if you're addicted is inelastic, right, compared to the elastic demand curve that you might have if you're not addicted. When you throw them together, you got two different sets of demands, and you can do different arguments. But it isn't that as much as it is. So what does the area under demand curve really mean? So like when we do benefit cost analysis, all this stuff in here, if you really look at this, you'll see there's a change in consumer surplus in here, right? And you'll see there's a change in economic rent, the producer surplus, and we've got change in government revenues, and we've got domestic and global, and all these different rates of return stuff we do. See this area underneath this domestic demand curve, for example, let's take this LFNN, right? That's the area of the utility, consumer surplus under that demand curve. The difference between these two is the consumer surplus net to the foreign country, because we bring imports in here with the president. But you see, you can't deny the fact that the concept of economic surplus, we've debated that for years, the profession agrees that it's legitimate. You can't deny the fact consumer surplus has to exist under demand curve. Now, you can say, even though the product might kill you, right? But that doesn't matter. Somewhere you're still getting utility from smoking in these models, right? So if you wouldn't get any utility from smoking, you wouldn't be willing to pay anything for a cigarette, etc. You see. So you see, but it doesn't matter. We're not going to here to debate whether there is or isn't. I'm just telling you, all their results in the Wall Street Journal, etc., all come down to the basic fact of what do we do with this surplus. They agree with everything except with our profession. We don't agree with what this area means for people, cigarette smokers. So I mean, if you put that area equal to 0, well then you're going to find out a totally different answer than if you set it at a positive number. So I mean, so in other words, if you increase the price of cigarettes, if it doesn't hurt smokers, that's different than if it hurts it if you measure it by the consumer surplus rate. And all that debate, I'll send you these papers, and all this debate in the Wall Street Journal, etc., all comes down to what does the benefit cost ratio look like when I attach 0 value to consumer surplus, or the normal value that we calculate under demand curve. And the ratios change from about 1.0 to about 11.0. It changes the benefit cost ratios by a factor of at least 10 in how you do the analysis. That's what it comes down in this debate now on this literature on So Karen, the last thing I want to talk about, since this is on the slide. So 7 years ago, we set up a group called the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis. And it was headed by Arnold Harberger from Chicago and Zerby from University of Washington and Kerry Smith and some others. So, and now this association, we had our 7th meeting in Washington. And we had to terminate the registration at 400 people. And it's gotten to be a huge society, and that's what it's called, the Society of Benefit Cost Analysis. And if you have any papers you want to submit, they have a big journal now. It's called the Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis, actually. So Karen, some of you people should come to their meetings and give some papers, but it's fascinating because you get a lot of government people involved there too that do work in benefit costs, like from transportation, health economics, and all the stuff they do. So they got into this topic. And Richard Just, my colleague that I've written books with, as you know, papers, etc., that he didn't believe in all this stuff, so well, unfortunately or fortunately for the Mormon Church, Richard left for the Mormon Church, so he doesn't do economics anymore. But in his day when he was doing economics, he argued that these people weren't rigorous enough to do benefit cost analysis because he said they don't understand welfare economics. So I'm going to give you 1 minute on welfare economics. This is what we call welfare economics analysis, right? The term benefit cost analysis never shows up in this stuff. When I talk about benefit cost analysis, what I'm doing essentially is using this as a framework. You know, when I calculate all these losers and gainers from this model, then I'm putting it into a benefit cost framework over here to kind of look at the benefit cost ratios from changing different programs. So the basis of benefit cost analysis in this model is welfare economics. Anybody see that? I use all those numbers to calculate this here. Then I'll quit with one last comment that the work Troy was doing. Can we flip that a little closer?
I can't zoom.
Anyway, that's fine. So now this debate comes, you must wonder when you do this analysis, how do you bring in time? How do you do discounting over time? And now that you got this big debate in the literature about what's the social discount rate made when you do benefit cost analysis. Do you use 7% or 3% or 4% or 5%? What do you do? So this paper actually, that Troy actually proves, our son in this dynamics model, we use a tobacco program as an example. We do analysis over 40 years, like they do in climate change now, some of these models from Harvard. So we see so what happens is the first 10 years, the buyout is based on 10 years and you have an equilibrium impact every year moving to the left. But in the 11th year you can go to this equilibrium over here because the program's gone. So what we do is we split the periods into the first 10 years and then the 11th period takes on a different benefit cost analysis. So that's what this paper is discounting. The interesting result of this is once you get past the 10th year, right, even though you switch the quantities and the prices, it has very little impact on the benefit cost, cost ratios. Also, more importantly, that the strong conclusion, interest rates don't make any difference. See, we get hung up on this notion of what is the social discount rate made. Well, my point is, if you look at this, let's take the simplest model, this domestic benefit cost ratio, simplest you can get from that model over there, that little expression in here. If I use, say, an interest rate of 5%, but if I use the interest rate on every component in the numerator and every component in the denominator, the interest rates aren't going to change any of the benefit cost ratios. Prove that. Right. So I mean, if I use a social discount rate of 5% or 10%, my benefit cost ratios aren't going to change one bit. But mathematically you can prove that, but you got to remember, I'm using the same discount rate on the top as I am on the bottom. Right? So now what's interesting about this debate is with this stuff we're doing with Arnold Harburger, so he always talks about the social cost of capital when they do all this project evaluation stuff. So now my point is, what happens if you take one of these models and you keep the interest rates the same except you change one of the interest rates on one of the components? So let's take the Ontario buyout where I have a cost from the government, so there's a cost of capital involved there. So what happens if I change the interest rate from say 5 to 8%? What happens to these results? Then you get some really interesting results, right? Then of course the interest rates are important because it just on the distribution, but it changes your benefit cost ratios totally too, right? Because they don't let them fool you. So this interest rates dynamics lots of times don't mean a thing to your analysis. It complicates it, but it doesn't really change anything. But what it does change, if you change the interest rate, but if you change it on one of those components, you're going to end up with a totally different benefit cost ratio than you did before. So this is that's kind of my story on the Ontario and buyout and the U.S. buyout. And you recognize that this stuff at the end is value judgments. I mean, when you people studied about the compensation principle and the Pareto principle, Pareto means you can't make anyone worse off. Compensation, you could have made everybody better off, but you don't. Those are all value judgments, whatever you do. Compensation is strictly a value judgment premise. And there's some cases that I know where governments don't compensate you at all when you're hurt from a government program. And of course, then you get into the legal issue of property rights that ties into this. Some of you people know, who's the gentleman I can't remember his name. Who's a gentleman from North Carolina that takes a real strong stand and writes the popular stuff about compensation? Sure, is it, or one of the, whoever the person is. So anyway, he takes the approach that he says also legally, in the U.S. tobacco buyout case, they didn't have to compensate the producers 1 cent to get rid of this government program. There's no legal basis. Somebody said there is in the Constitution that you can't buy out, because I guess the quota is a property value, right? So in other words, a property right, so whatever you have to do. But I know that debate goes on forever and ever. So all this stuff you could debate and say, well, it looks like the Ontario people were very successful rent seeking, and it looks like the U.S. tobacco people were at the same time. And now the last comment is going to make some of you upset, so no, we're not quite finished with this, because we're also looking at the distribution of the buyout. Who got the money? And one time I was at, our son went to medical school for a while here in Tennessee, and I was sitting one night at the bar with a guy, and he's a big tobacco grower, and he says, you know, by the way, he says, I says, how's farming going? He says, great. I says, I heard farming was a tough business to be in. And he says, yeah, it is. But he never told me they had the big buyout, right? So this was about in 2006 when he was talking, right? So anyway, and then I heard stories that 4 football players actually ended up owning, getting most of the $9 billion from this buyout. And everybody said, this is pretty interesting. And so that was a purpose of our tomato harvester paper, roughly, right? From these issues, there's losers and gainers, and there's distributional issues all the time through there. So what do you think this industry would look like? So what was the compensation? This isn't a negative comment. It's just trying to be factual and trying to figure out what actually did happen in a lot of government programs, because there was no cap placed on the amount of payment you could get in the buyout. Not like a lot of our government programs, right? So my hypothesis is that 10% of the farmers likely got 90% of the money. So that's what we're testing, and it's pretty close. Now, man, and I know politicians never, and if they don't, I think lots of times they don't even want to address the issue. They may know the answer. They want to bring in this issue about bigness and smallness, right? And you see what happened in that particular case, and this isn't being negative, this just shows you how smart some of these people are. What happens is we have a section in there about quota price manipulation. Because you see, if you develop a model about the outcome, if I already know the outcome's going to happen, right? So if you and I are sitting here as farmers or government, and I already know 2 years from now there's going to be a buyout. And we know they're going to be based on quota value or quota prices, right? Whatever we're going to do. Well, we can manipulate the data so that we can get the highest payouts you want. Because you see, in this whole setup happens to be farmers and landowners. So in this particular case, a lot of these farmers actually owned their own land, but they also rented or bought quota from the people that own tobacco land. And our results show it's easy to manipulate the rental price before the agreement ever happened in order to maximize the payment from the government to the producer. So you have to bring in then a more complicated dynamic model, and with that, see this model that has a land market to it that has a quota value attached to it, so it's not a standard land market. So the land is also a function, the price is a function of the quota value attached to it when you transfer it and sell it as quota rights. So that's another issue we work on about this whole distributional effect to one of these buyouts. But again, it's like this old argument in economics. If you're wealthy, you can hire a lawyer in all these cases, right? And I'll guarantee you the payout is going to be high by hiring a lawyer to fight. It's like antitrust, or it's like the whole thing on anti-dumping and the whole business like that. So it's kind of a game where you expect to pay out, hire a lawyer, and you're going to expect that your payout's going to be higher than what the lawyer is going to cost you. So this is kind of the bottom of this whole thing on compensation. Again, good for the farmers, whatever we're going to do. And I'm not going to get into debate the farm bill, the new one, whatever. We're all split on that. Sure. Yeah, let's hope.
I have a question about the supply curve there. You keep it stationary, but it seems like the buyout would cause it to move.
Well, now so in your particular case, no, we're very clear on that. So now, because my buddy White from USDA and another 2 people, the guy went to Illinois, they do kind of the dynamics of supply model after the buyout. So right, they're trying to talk about technological change and the amalgamation and consolidation of farm sites. You're right. Yeah. We're just taking one point in time. We're just taking the buyout as it existed right at that particular time. Yeah. So we have other models where we do the dynamics of the impact. Yeah. Yeah. This isn't that's an impact. This one, but the other stuff is just static in the sense. This is a pool of money that you got. How is it distributed and on what basis? Right? So it's interesting though in this particular case that actually the case in Canada that we worked on for years over marketing boards, the Canadian Wheat Board, is an interesting example where the governments didn't compensate anybody. So when the governments terminated the Wheat Board 2 years ago, and there's these big lawsuits now against the government, and given the fact that they had general agreement that the Wheat Board on premiums over the free market case, the farmers never got one nickel in compensation for this whole thing, right? And you see, that's where politics comes in, because then you take a look at the various associations that exist in society. So you had some associations hated the Wheat Board. Some associations loved the Wheat Board. So when they get in this political fight, they have no unanimity in terms of how they defend the payouts. That's what's always amazing about the American Farm Bureaus, how they can bring all these different groups together and at the end speak with one voice. Your sugar case, for example, is even better on the rent-seeking of the sugar industry. Yeah, that's a good point in terms of the dynamics of this is interesting. So yeah, so Troy actually does this analysis, but so what happens is, even though the quantity went down, you're in a different supply curve in the sense that the supply curves are shifted, right, because of that. I was with a guy last night that's really interesting, is that this come to this graduation. He worked 31 years with Philip Morris on obviously the bacon cigarettes, and I was interested to get this discussion about, I was telling Karen, I said, I didn't know the biggest user of sugar was actually making cigarettes, but I didn't know that for a long time. But anyway, he got into this discussion about this whole the dynamics of the processing industry and what happened. And you see, when this buyout happened in 2004, we were all these tobacco stocks that were in place, a huge number. I mean, we have the data on that, and we always wondered what happened to these tobacco stocks when you went to after the buyout. But there was some deal they made with the cigarette manufacturers that they forced the cigarette manufacturers into buying all these stocks. I don't know what price they agreed to. So you're not holding any stocks hardly anymore in these marketplaces. People in Washington found these papers interesting, but they thought the more interesting part was also the trade component of that, because they never see much of a trade model ever built into one of these models. It's usually domestic discussion, but you got to bring in the total demand curve and separate the distribution across countries. And now with China, I mean, China's a huge importer of cigarettes, and then you get this, And also, I guess your question is, but also somebody should estimate, why didn't somebody try to estimate a demand curve for cigarettes? There are none. We assume there's an elasticity of 0.5. It comes from somebody, but no one knows where it ever came from, the elasticity of 0.7. Because you know how tough it is to estimate? We tried to estimate a demand for cigarettes. That looks like an easy job, doesn't it? Try it. Because you got to interfere with the e-cigarettes coming in, right? You got the marijuana now may substitute a bit. You got this whole health, you got the addiction, and we can't get a demand curve to ever fit. And you know what happens is a demand for cigarettes, and these farmers knew that. That's what they wanted to buy out. They already knew their industry was collapsing because this demand curve has shifted so dramatically over time. I mean, it's unbelievable. Just like the one in Ontario. That's why you see when I showed you that big box to start with in 53, that's what the demand looked like in 53 compared to what it looked like the demand curve shifted by 50% over that time. You see, so you're dealing with a dynamic model, not just on the supply side. The demand side we're trying to do too, but it's difficult to estimate a demand curve. But that's a good thesis for somebody, a student that wants to work in this area. What do you think, Karen?
Great. Thank you.
I got a quick.
He's got it.
So, I realize you used a point in time, but realizing that in the United States they were also cutting quota, does that not play into the supply side?
Oh yeah. You see this?
Because we have a
Oh, yeah. See, if they would have, no, that's right. See, we figured out that if they would have used, for example, data 2 years after the time they did, they based it on data, I think, 2002. Like if they would even use data for 2003 or 4, they wouldn't have got near to the compensation they got. Because the quantity had already dropped a fair bit between those, within those 2 year period.
Yeah, but I guess my question is wouldn't that, from a producer standpoint, say, yeah, I want to get rid of a quota system because you keep on cutting my quota, so therefore my marginal benefit is dropping anyway?
Well, that's why exactly why the farmers, and what we understood is why these farmers, when they lobbied the government to get rid of the quota, because they said eventually our industry is going to be broke if this demand keeps shifting to the left as fast as it is, Russia. Right? So it was they were smart to doing that. So they already knew this issue you're talking about look, we're going to wake up someday and that demand curve may have moved another 30% to the left for tobacco. Yeah, good point. Yeah, that's it. So right, the choice is also very critical of what data they used and what period they use for the buyout rent. They picked one, like Ontario picked that big quota because they didn't have to worry, it's a fixed in law there, where the Americans had to take a price quantity argument that, I don't have a child, yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, I appreciate coming, thanks.
Got no other questions?